Good to have you here. As always, kind of community life stuff we want to let you guys know about. How many of you like to have fun? Show of hands. That should be all of us. Okay, you like to have fun. How many of you have elementary school age children? That will be fewer of us. Okay, if you like to have fun and you have elementary school age children, this Friday night is family fun night. It's going to be freezing outside, so why not come do something fun inside here? So there's going to be games and crafts. It's this Friday night, the 18th, and there's going to be a dance, because we do like to get down here at Blackhawk, as some of you experienced Friday night. Oh, yeah. The cost is going to be $5 per family, and if you are going to come, you could bring some sweets or a dessert to share, because kids need lots of sugar, right? So there's information in your bulletin and online, and you do need to register online so that they can kind of know how many people are coming. So that's this Friday night. Two other pieces we want to let you guys know about. On Sundays, we don't do anything like typical kind of like Sunday school kind of thing. What we do on Sundays are these kind of rotating classes. They're called Discover classes, and they're little 1 hour kind of one-shot deals where we explore core values that we have as a community. So there's two of these coming up. One is next Sunday. It's at 10:45 a.m. It's called Discovering Blackhawk, and this is led by Chris and another leader here, Nancy Lindroth, and this is kind of an intro to who we are as a community, why we do what we do the way that we do it. So that is next Sunday, 10:45. And then there was another one this Sunday, and this was announced last Sunday, called Discover Serving, and that's tonight at 6 p.m. So we believe all of us have unique talents and abilities to contribute to the mission of Jesus and what we're doing, and many of which will be a part of what we're doing here on Sundays. So this is kind of a 1 hour intro, kind of a cosmic map to all of the different ways to get plugged in and to serve around in our community life here at Blackhawk. So there's no obligation, there's no like sales pitch or whatever. You just come and hear stories and hear about opportunities, and it's a cool way to find out what's going on here. So that's tonight, when? 6 p.m. in the Fireside Room. You got it. Sound good? Awesome. Okay. Today we are continuing our series in the latter half of 1 Corinthians called As We Gather. We're focusing on the last kind of 6-7 chapters of the book. And today, just kind of let you know, our time together in this room and all the other rooms in downtown is going to culminate in communion, in taking the bread and the cup together. So as we dive into the text, as we seek to hear a word from God through the scriptures, just kind of have that in the forefront of your mind. That's where we're going with the service today, kind of culminating in the bread and the cup. Before we dive into the text, though, I want to show you a picture of two German men who are no longer with us. Friedrich, how do you want to pronounce that last name? It's a tongue twister. Friedrich von Bodelschwingh, all right? All right, senior and junior. This is father-son right here, Friedrich von Bodelschwingh. These two Friedrichs are responsible for starting one of the kind of oldest and longest running and one of the largest and most significant care organizations for the physically and mentally disabled in Germany. Friedrich Sr. started what was called the Bethel Foundation in 1867, and it still exists today. It's an amazing organization. And I came across the story of the Bethel Foundation in a biography that I read recently about the well-known pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Anybody heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer before? An amazing individual. Dietrich and Friedrich Jr. lived during the time of Hitler's rise to power and during the rise of the Third Reich, the Nazi regime. And Bonhoeffer actually died as part of a resistance movement against Hitler. Friedrich Jr. and Dietrich Bonhoeffer knew each other. And on one occasion, Dietrich Bonhoeffer went to visit the Bethel community that the Friedrichs had started. Now, I want to read to you the description of Dietrich visiting the Bethel community. It was mesmerizing to me the first time that I read it. Bethel began in 1867 as a Christian community for people with epilepsy. But by 1900, included several facilities that cared for 1,600 physically and mentally disabled persons. Friedrich Jr. took it over at his father's death in 1910, and by the 1930s, it was a whole town with schools, churches, farms, factories, shops, and housing for patients, nurses, and caregivers. At the center were numerous hospital and care facilities, including orphanages. Bonhoeffer saw Bethel as the antithesis of the Nazi worldview, the exalted power and strength. It was the gospel made visible, a fairy tale landscape of grace, where the physically and mentally disabled were cared for in a palpably Christian atmosphere. Now let's just leave it up there for a second. When I read about the Bethel, the first thing I did was go to Wikipedia, right, and go online and start learning more. I was just, a fascinating story, what a cool organization. And just amazed, it still exists today in 12 different cities in Germany, caring for 14,000 people in the hospitals and orphanages and schools and clinics and so on. And what captured me was that little description right near the end there, when Dietrich visited the Bethel community. In contrast to kind of the cultural climate that Bonhoeffer saw around him, when he visited Bethel, it was like visiting a different country. Did you see that? It was like visiting a different land. And this little phrase here, it just captured my imagination. It was like visiting a fairy tale land. It's like, where do places like this exist? A fairy tale land of grace. It's like a different country. And there's the gospel made visible. So I've been pondering this. This has kind of lodged itself in kind of my mind and heart over the last few months. What Dietrich is encountering here, in a sense, he actually really is visiting a different land. He's visiting a different country, a community of self-giving love, where everyone elevates the others above themselves, especially those who in their society had the lowest place. And it was totally foreign in contrast to the rest of their culture and the Nazi worldview. They were speaking a different language. And it was the language that the New Testament writers called the language of agape. When Christ followers learn to speak and live agape, it creates little oases in our world, little fairy tale landscapes of grace, wherever they go. And this is the kind of life that Jesus called his followers to. It's the kind of life that Paul is challenging the Corinthians to embrace, especially when they gather in their gatherings. And he explores this in a famous chapter that we call 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Why don't you grab your Bibles and turn with me to 1 Corinthians 13. You're going to find it on page 813 in the brown Bibles here. This is the second time we have landed in 1 Corinthians 13 in the last year. So you may remember back at the beginning of the ministry year in September, Chris kind of opened up the first half of the series we did in 1 Corinthians and our ministry year, focusing on this love where you live theme, exploring what it means to be a person of agape. Today, we're kind of going back to 1 Corinthians, but we're seeing how it fits into the flow of the letter now. We're approaching it in kind of a bigger context in that way. But Paul is challenging the Corinthians as they gather to create a little fairy tale landscape of grace whenever they get together. So we know that first, the Church of Corinth was not a fairy tale landscape of grace, right? I mean, poor Corinthians, man, I mean, yeesh. So we've been tracking the history of conflict and division in this church. These are just some of the things that we've been focusing on as we've gone throughout this letter. We know that there were divisions and little tribes in the church, people following their favorite teachers. We know that there were different church members suing each other, taking each other to court. We remember that there was a division, we covered this, between the Jewish and the non-Jewish people in the church community about meat sacrificed to idols. The poor members of the church were being ostracized by the wealthy in their celebration of the Lord's Supper. And then in these chapters that we're exploring now, there was a division because certain people that had what I'm going to call spectacular spiritual gifts were disturbing the Sunday gathering. That's chapter 12 and chapter 14, and what comes right in the middle, math majors? 1 Corinthians 13. So 1 Corinthians 13 was not written to people who are getting married, even though it's a wonderful passage to read at weddings, okay? It was not written to people getting married. It was written to people who had a chaotic Sunday gathering. Because certain individuals, so Chris talked about this last week, chapter 12. Paul's talking about how everyone in the church community has unique talents and abilities that can be empowered by God's Spirit and used to serve the mission of Jesus, especially in the Sunday gathering. But there are two particular gifts that are being abused in the Corinthian gatherings. Look at chapter 13. They're just literally in the first sentences here. Look at verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels, and verse 2, if I have the gift of prophecy, speaking in tongues and prophecy. Chris talked about them a little bit last week. I'm going to talk about them just a little bit today and in quite a bit of detail next week. So in their Sunday gatherings, some Corinthians were having very, very intense experiences of prayer and worship, an intense experience of God's presence. And when they prayed out loud, out of kind of this intense experience, what came out was not a language or sounds that anybody understood, and that the speaker themselves did not understand. And for the people who were doing this, it was a very, very powerful, impacting experience. It was a great experience for them. And it was an experience that many of the Corinthians had had before they were Christ followers, when they worshipped the Greek and the Roman gods in the various temples and ceremonies there. And so many of the Corinthians took this as like a badge of being super spiritual, of being able to come to the Sunday gathering and have these powerful experiences of prayer and God's presence. And that was fine as far as it went, but there were lots of other people in the Sunday gathering who, when they heard this, it made them uncomfortable. They didn't understand what was going on. They were not able to worship or engage. And it made many of them feel like second-rate Christians. And not only that, but many of the Corinthians are like talking over each other. They're interrupting. There's lots of people talking at once. And Sunday was like chaos for the Corinthians. And so Paul writes 1 Corinthians 13 to address that problem. It's just ironic the way the Bible gets used in different ways throughout history, right? But there you go. That's why Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 13. Because many of the Corinthians are coming to the Sunday gathering with nothing in mind except looking for my own kind of private religious experience. And they're ostracizing and making lots of other people uncomfortable. And Paul's like, yeah, what are you doing? So he just kind of introduces and rides the wave in. Let's go, verse 1. I will show you the most excellent way. You see, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but if I do not have... this is where you all participate. If I do not have... I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Do you see what he's saying here? Do you see what he's saying? I'm not sure that we do see what he's saying. How many of you are mildly annoyed? Right? This, sorry. This is what our lives sound like when we claim association with Jesus, but in our day-to-day relationships, we do not treat people with love and grace. It hurts God's ears. That's what Paul is saying. And if that was enough to communicate the point, he goes for 2 more rounds. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and... Okay, got me out of breath. Mysteries and knowledge. If I have faith that can move mountains, I cannot illustrate that. But if I do not have love, I'm nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor, if I surrender my body to the flames, but if I do not have, I gain nothing. You can be the most super spiritual, Bible-thumping, reading, religious, give yourself to the poor, social justice innovator. But if you do not treat the people who are closest to you with grace and love and consideration in the day-to-day, it's noise. You're wasting your time. Now, we have a huge obstacle as we read these verses here because we can't read this. Dude, I can't. So talk amongst yourselves while I catch my... Okay. I guess you can talk while you inhale, but I'm just kind of... Okay, anyway. All right, thank you. We have a huge obstacle when we're reading this chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and that obstacle is the English language, right? So we're not reading this in the language that Paul wrote it in, and that language is Greek, ancient Greek. So when we read this word love, I don't think we really get what Paul is saying here because, and we've covered this ground before, I don't think we can cover it often enough. The English word love is like the most unhelpful, unclear word in our language. I'm convinced of it because I can say to you, I love pizza and I love my wife. And if the word means the same thing in those sentences, I have issues, right? So I likely have issues anyway, okay? But I have issues. What does that mean? It's the most unhelpful word. In English, love is a feeling. It's an emotion. And it's something that happens to you, right? Valentine's Day, for goodness sakes, right? So this naked baby with grotesque wings shoots you in the butt with an arrow, right? And all of it, oh, and then I'm in love now, right? And of course, if love is just something that happens to you, right, then of course the arrow can dislodge after a few years. And then, we're not in love anymore, really. It's just kind of, That is not what Paul is talking about here. When Paul uses this word, when Jesus uses this word, agape is not a feeling. It is not something that just happens to you. You choose it. Agape is action. It is behavior. So we've used this definition before. Agape is acting for the well-being of another, regardless of how they respond to me. Whether they're a family member, whether they're an enemy, they may be both. Maybe it's a friend. Doesn't matter. Regardless of how they respond to me, my mission is to seek their well-being, no matter what the cost. And when Christ followers act like this, it stands out and it creates a fairy tale landscape of grace in that setting. That's what Paul is talking about here. And the early Christians did not get this definition of agape from reading a dictionary. They got this definition from the story of the gospel. So just three key verses here, if you want to jot them down. 3 key definitions of agape in the New Testament here. Jesus, talking to his disciples, he says, John 15, "This is my command to you, agape each other. In the same way that I have agaped you, there is no greater agape than to lay down one's life for one's friends." Paul writes to the Ephesians, "Live a life of agape, just as Christ agaped us." And what does that mean? He gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. The Apostle John, "This is how we know what agape is. Not that the naked baby shoots you with an arrow." No. You want to know agape? Jesus defines agape. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Agape is action. It's self-giving love for the benefit of another person, regardless of how they respond to me. We've talked about this before. I don't think we can talk about it often enough. Because this kind of thing is so rare, not only in our world, it's rare just in our lives. Because it's like a foreign language. It's like speaking the strange language that none of us were born speaking. None of us were born speaking agape, right? You have to learn it. So this sounds very great, but this is really 30,000 feet here. What does self-giving love look like? Concrete behaviors. What are we talking about here? Paul gives us a 16-part definition of agape. It doesn't get more comprehensive than this. Verses 4 through 8. Here's agape. Agape is patience. Agape is kindness. Agape does not envy. It does not boast, or it is not proud. Agape doesn't think highly of itself. It finds a way to think highly of the other person. Even if there's just a very little tiny bit of the other person that is worth thinking highly about. You know what I'm saying? It finds it. That's what agape does. Agape is not rude. It is not self-seeking, implication being it is others-seeking. Agape is not easily angered. Agape does not keep a record of wrongs. Agape does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Agape always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. Agape never fails. Now let's just ask one question of all 16 of these traits of agape. Look at them there with me. Look at the list and ask yourself, do any of these things just happen to you? Do you happen to just behave in any of these ways without thinking about it? So let's say you're in a relational conflict. Have you ever had one of those before? Right? So you're in a relational conflict, and it's your spouse, it's a friend or a roommate, it's a coworker, whatever, and they have snubbed you, they have provoked you, just totally wronged you, and in the heat of the moment, what is it that just happens to come out of you? Well, patience and kindness, of course, right? Because it's love. It just happens to you, right? This is love. No. In the grit of a moment like that, you choose agape. You choose patience and kindness, even though it makes no sense at all. And in that moment, it creates this little alternative reality, this different kind of landscape than the rest of the world around you in that moment. It's like a little fairy tale land where we behave the way that we're called to, the way that we're made for. It's agape. It's like learning a new language. So the Corinthians, he lands back down in the Corinthian situation here. He says the Corinthians are coming together in their Sunday gatherings. And as they come, their mindset of many of them is not what will benefit everybody else as we gather today. Some of them, their mindset is, how can I have the most intense religious experience that I can get out of this gathering here today? And for many, it was through speaking in tongues or through prophecy. And Paul is just saying, guys, that's just so having your mind on the wrong set of priorities. So he goes on, verse 8, after love never fails. He says, listen, where there are prophecies, they're going to cease. Where they're speaking in tongues, they will be stilled. Where there's knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. This is actually pretty dense and profound what Paul's saying here. He's contrasting two periods of time here. He's talking about the present age in which we all live and the future age when perfection comes. He's talking about when Christ returns to bring his healing justice to our world, when he sets all things right. And as Isaiah the prophet said, when the glory and the presence of Yahweh floods the whole creation like the waters cover the sea. He says, but we don't live in that reality now. We can, however, get little glimpses, little tastes of that future flooding of creation with God's presence. And you can get little glimpses we get the glimpses of that in prayer or in worship, when you experience the love and the presence of the Spirit and of Jesus. But he says to make those experiences the main thing, he says, listen, those experiences aren't going to be necessary one day. Just like you don't need a flashlight once the sun rises. Prophecy and speaking in tongues, you're going to let that divide your church? No, that's going to fade away one day. He explores it from a different angle with a different metaphor. Verse 11, he says, when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I grew up, when I became a man, I put childish ways behind me, saying to the Corinthians, you're acting like kids. Like all coming together and you're focusing just on your own priorities and looking for your own little religious experience here. No, that's how kids behave. Mature humans who are being transformed by God's Spirit are people who know how to live in a different kind of landscape. The landscape of agape, who prioritize the needs of others above their own. The metaphor has just come flying here. He uses a different metaphor. Verse 12, he says, think of it this way. It's like we're looking in a poor reflection as in a mirror. But then we will see face to face. You see, now we just know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So I think actually what happened is that he was thinking about the Corinthians, but once he started talking about agape, his mind just started getting carried away with the wonder of the story of the gospel. So he's like, we live here in the present, in day to day, and how many of us can claim to have the world and our lives figured out? There's no. And so we behave, and the way we live and treat other people is out of that haziness. It's like we're looking in this hazy, dirty mirror, and I can kind of see and make sense of what's going on, and I don't always get things right, but one day will come when we see clearly. And not only will we see clearly, we'll see that the whole story was not just about me stumbling around in this world, it was about God looking for me. We will know just as we are known. And he says, this is the world of agape. It's a different landscape. It's where the whole creation is going. And he says, if you want to focus on anything in the present when you gather, don't be looking for some little private religious experience. You want to know what lasts? You want to know how to treat each other in a way that gets you in touch with eternity? It's not speaking in tongues or prophecy. It's agape. Look at how he finishes, verse 13. Now these three remain, faith, hope, and agape. But the greatest of these is agape. This chapter is worth many cups of tea and many mornings of prayer and meditation. He boils the whole of the Christian journey down to these three virtues: faith, hope, and agape. So in the present, following Christ is a journey of faith and hope. Because of the historical fact of Jesus' resurrection, we have hope and faith that he will return one day and that he really is set on his mission to redeem and to restore our world. But there will come a day when the sun rises and we don't need the flashlight anymore. Because faith will become sight and hope will become reality. But will agape fade too? No. Agape is what this whole story is about. Agape is what the new creation is all about. Agape is what we're made for, and we know it in our bones. That's why when we hear the story about the Bethel community, we just go, yes, that is so right. When people do that. When we act out of agape for the needs of another person, Paul's saying we're in touch with something that's eternal. When you give up your ego and your priorities to seek the well-being, when you're patient, when you forgive, when you don't light your short fuse, when you're putting yourself aside and highlighting and elevating the other person, Paul's saying you are in touch with something at the core of the meaning of life, at the core of God's essence. It's agape. And acts done out of agape will last into God's new world. This is very profound. And this is not theory. Every single day that you and I wake up, we have a choice of what language we're going to speak. Are we going to speak the language that just comes naturally to us? It just comes out of us, right? And we know that language really well. We were born with it. It's the language of selfishness and of self-preservation and of ego. Or are we going to partner with God's Spirit and learn a different language altogether, the language of agape? This is the choice, this is the challenge that 1 Corinthians 13 puts in front of every one of us. So here's what I'd like us to do. Cards. When you came into the room, you should have picked up a 1 Corinthians 13 card. If you did not, why don't you wave your hand in the air like you just don't care, and there will be people who would love to give you one of these cards. On one side is the whole chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. The second side is just verses 4 through 8, which are the 16 descriptions of agape. If you're unclear as to what a life of self-giving love looks like, here you go. Verses 4 through 8. So what we're going to do, something a little different than what we normally do. I'm going to invite in this room and all the other rooms in downtown the music teams to come up. And we have one of our musicians, as part of our Black Hawk Worship Arts community here, has written a song, the words of which are verses 4 through 8. And music teams are going to play that song, play it through slowly. It lasts a number of minutes. And what I would just kind of encourage you to do is just sit there with these 16 descriptions of agape before you. And I would just encourage you to ask God to show you. Think of specific people or situations, family and work in your mind, and ask God to show you which of these 16 are most relevant for you right now. It might be all 16. It's okay. That's probably for me too. But it might just be one. It might just be two. And, this challenge to memorize 1 Corinthians 13, it still stands. Chris issued it in September. I'm reissuing it right now. If you want, the song that they're about to play is going to be available to download for free on the front page of our website. Put it on your iPod, put it on your computer, put it on a CD, and use it to memorize and meditate on these verses. And the time is yours to just kind of sit with 1 Corinthians 13 and ask God to speak to you, to help you learn the language of agape.
Peace.